first talk of the day will be Pivoting Clouds in AWS Organization by Scott Weston. Before we get into it, just want to give a quick shout out to Prisma Cloud, our sponsor. Prisma Cloud is industry's most comprehensive cloud-native application protection platform with the broadest security and compliance coverage for applications, data, and the entire cloud-native technology stack throughout the development lifecycle and across hybrid and multi-cloud environments. Just as a reminder, we'll be taking questions, so feel free to raise your hands at the end of the talk, or we'll also be monitoring Slack, YouTube, Twitter for questions. With that said, welcome, Scott.
Okay, so without further ado, I'll jump into the presentation here. So pivoting clouds in AWS organizations. Hopefully you're at the right talk. If you're not, you're still in luck because you get to learn about AWS organizations. So in terms of myself, I'm a senior security consultant at a company called NetSpy. They're a cybersecurity consulting agency. They do pretty much testing in almost any service line you can think of: websites, mobile, mainframe, internal, external, and cloud, obviously. So they have a booth over in the vendor section that you can check out in your free time. In terms of myself, my tag is web and root. That's what I use on Twitter, LinkedIn, all that kind of stuff. I've got experience in web applications and GraphQL, cloud environments, specifically AWS, and then those are some of the bug bounties I've been listed in. I have around 3-ish years experience in info security, and some of the projects I've done is I made a 250 plus slide deck taking someone with zero knowledge in AWS all the way up to intro to red teaming, hopefully. And then as we'll talk about in this talk, I've published a couple Pacu modules. So kind of a show of hands before I get started. Who's familiar with AWS organizations? Okay, well, that makes this really easy then. So why should I care about AWS organizations? Right? Like, I think that's most talks, that's the first question I usually ask is like, why should I care? Because some talks are really interesting, but if you're not applying that knowledge, then it's maybe not as useful in like the day-to-day role. So obviously you all know AWS is a major cloud provider. If you're thinking about cloud or you think your company uses cloud, then there's a good chance AWS is being used. And if it's a larger organization, then there's a good chance that the AWS organization service is being used. Understanding how to pivot in AWS organizations helps from a blue team perspective because it helps reduce the potential blast radius because you kind of get in the mindset of the attacker, while from a red team perspective, it helps kind of understand what your blast radius could be. One of the caveats I'll mention now is throughout this presentation, I'm going to say things like, assume you've compromised this account. So yes, the prerequisite for a lot of this is that you've compromised credentials. So like ideally, an attacker should never have a foothold that I'm going to describe, but we're all security cognizant, so we all know that ideally that doesn't really live up to the reality sometimes. So kind of the overarching plan is when I was looking into AWS privilege escalation, a lot of the articles I read out there focused on a single AWS account. So the idea was that you would privilege escalate to essentially like administrator access of a single AWS account, and that's usually where the articles would end. Sometimes there'd be some cross-account jumping, but for the most part, it was kind of trying to compromise that inherent security boundary, right? Because if you have an AWS account and your friend has an AWS account, there's kind of an inherent security boundary there where like you can't just mess with your friend's EC2 instances, for example, unless you explicitly set up some cross-account stuff. But AWS organizations is nice because it groups a lot of accounts together. So there's kind of an inherent way to kind of tunnel through some of those security boundaries, and you can turn a single AWS account takeover into multiple AWS account takeovers by kind of jumping around the organization. So that was kind of the goal I started out with. First, I'll talk about AWS organizations briefly because it sounds like most of you already know what it is, so I don't need to go too in-depth. But this is kind of like a helpful diagram I made. It might be hard to see in the back, but basically you have 3 AWS accounts. When you go ahead and make an organization that groups all these individual AWS accounts together, the account that makes the organization is called the management account. You can kind of think of it like the admin for the organization. They have significant write privileges over the organization. They can invite accounts, they could boot accounts, they could even just delete the entire organization if they wanted. They have a lot of power over the organization. And then all the other accounts that join the organization are essentially called member accounts. And a default member account has significantly less privileges. All they can really do is read and have a few read writes. So all member accounts know is that they're in an organization and who the management account is. So like one of the interesting things I always find is that in that diagram on the right, account C, for example, knows that it's in an organization and that account A is the management account, but account C has no idea that account B exists because account C can only see itself and the management account. Organizational units, those are just kind of like, I won't dive into those, but those are kind of like folders helping with organization, and you can attach SCPs to those within the organization. And then root is just a special one that's always at root, just so you can attach an SCP to it and it propagates downwards to everyone. So this is what it looks like from the UI perspective if you're not familiar with it. So you can see that you've got your AWS organization, or it might be hard to see, but you have the root folder and then a couple organizational units, and then within each organizational unit, in this case, this kind of lab I set up, you have individual AWS accounts. You can see the management account has a special tag next to it called management account. And one of the interesting things is when you're looking at a default member account versus a management account, you can already see a difference from the UI perspective. So if you're a pen tester, for example, and you've compromised an account and you're trying to figure out, okay, am I a management account? Am I a member account? You can look at the nav bar on the far left in the UI. And so for the management account, there's actually more tabs in that nav bar, or it looks different. And the management account can see all of the AWS accounts. So that's a nice giveaway that you have compromised a management account. And then a member account, you'll see the nav bar is significantly smaller, and all you can really see is that you are in an organization, and if you try to list the AWS accounts, you'll get a permission denied error because that's expected because you're a member account and you really can't do anything except read that you're in an organization. So the first thing, how to pivot in AWS. So I talked about member accounts, how they're the accounts that are added to an organization. There's two ways to add an account to an organization. You can choose to create the AWS account and add it to the organization at the same time, and that's what we're going to talk about now. And then I'll show how the other way is you can invite a pre-existing AWS account, and that requires some different techniques to kind of jump from management to member account. So first, we're going to talk about account creation. So in AWS organizations, you can choose to create an account and add it to the organization at the same time. Some of you are probably familiar with this feature. So, when you look at AWS organization research and what people are doing to pivot and stuff, this is kind of, I think, what most people know about is this predefined role name. So when you go to create an AWS account, it might be hard to see, but in the bottom box there, it will pre-populate a name for an IAM role. And so when that member account gets created in your organization, that role also implicitly gets created in that member account, and that role automatically trusts the management account and has administrator access. So because the role name is the same name for everyone when it's pre-populated, that's a good guess to try to get into the member account. And this is just showing what the account looks like. So you can see it just trusts the management account and has administrator access. And I think this diagram, okay, yeah, I think you can see that helps kind of visualize it. So you have your management account on the left, and then the management account created account D on the right. And when it created account D on the right and added it to the organization, it automatically created a role called organization account access role in the member account that implicitly trusts the management account. So you can see like a bad actor or attacker in the management account could just jump to the member account if they know that role exists. So you can basically turn your takeover of just the management account to both the management account and that member account. In this diagram, I just have one member account. But if you make a bunch of AWS accounts, this role will, if you don't change the default role name, this role will exist in all the member accounts. So imagine you have like 30 member accounts on the right. You could just brute force each member account for this specific role name and try to assume it. But that's kind of like really annoying if you have to do that 30 times. So I made a Pacu module, so this is just showing the assume role at the command line. So management account, you start out as the management account, you assume the role in the member account, and then your admin in the member account. So I created a module for Pacu. I guess how many people are familiar with Pacu? Raise of hands. All right, cool. If you're not familiar with Pacu, it's just an AWS exploitation library written in Python and published by Rhino Security. It uses modules, so you can write like a Python module to do a specific task, and you load your credentials into Pacu, and then you run these modules to do certain tasks. So a couple months ago, I added AWS organization support to Pacu. I added an enumeration module, which we'll cover at the end. And then the one we're talking about now is one I recently added called organizations assume role. There's my pull links. If you don't trust my code, you can read the code. And so the one I created a couple weeks ago, you just run, so you load your credentials into Pacu, you run organizations assume role, it will try to list all the member accounts, and then it will try to go to every member account and try to assume that default role name. I also made it pretty customizable, so you can actually, it doesn't show it here, but if you, I think it's the help flag or whatever, when you run it, you can also pass in a list of account names, and you can also pass in a list of role names. So you can really just use this as a generic assume role brute force tool too, if you wanted. So that is in the official Pacu repository, I believe, merged as of last week. But what if this technique doesn't work, right? So the default role name is the one you probably read about the most when you're looking at AWS organizations, but there's a lot of ifs, and that organization or that role might not exist. So like the person you've compromised or the principal you've compromised might not have assume role privileges. The new member account might have been invited, or it might have been pre-existing and invited instead of created, in which case that role does not automatically get created. Or the client could have just deleted the role. Or they changed the role name to be so complex you couldn't brute force it with a word list. So kind of the point is like, what if that default role does not exist? What could you do then? And so that's where I spent a lot of time looking. And so to understand that, I have to talk about trusted access and delegated administration. And again, why am I doing this? It's because if you invite an existing account, as you can see from the AWS documentation, it does not automatically create a role in that account that you can just automatically assume. It just adds it to the organization. So hopefully this is the last diagram. So organizations is a pretty versatile service, but then AWS has a whole suite of services, right? So it would make sense that AWS would integrate a lot of these services into organizations to kind of maximize the potential of the service. So AWS has several organization integrated features. I'm being very careful with my words there because it can be a bit confusing. It's not like the entire service is integrated with organizations. It's a specific feature within that service. So for example, you wouldn't say all of IAM is integrated with organizations. You would say the IAM Access Analyzer feature within the IAM service integrates with organizations. And within that feature, there's like a specific subset of APIs, but all of them kind of do different things. I think there's around 20 plus of them, so I can't really give you a generic like what should they do, because you have to look at them individually. But kind of one commonality is that when they integrate with the organization, whatever they're doing usually expands from a single account to the entire organization. So IAM Access Analyzer, for example, normally you would run that on a single account. When you integrate it in an organization, it now runs on the entire organization and all the accounts. But all these organization integrated features are kind of in an off state by default, is like how I'd like to think of it. So when you make an organization, you invite all your member accounts, you can't just immediately start using IAM Access Analyzer because it's in that off state by default. And that's where trusted access comes in. So trusted access in organizations is the act of basically granting one of those specific features authority to access the organization data and giving it the authority to go into the different member accounts and create whatever roles or data it needs. And so I like to think of it as basically the on switch for the organization integrated features. You're basically switching it on and saying you trust it to act within the organization. And that's basically emphasized by the, I guess, brown or orange, or I don't know what color that is, lines in the diagram. But let's see. So usually you have your management account here. And so you would enable trusted access for a specific feature here. And then that feature could then reach into all the different accounts in the organization. And so something to note here is that like as a malicious actor or as a bad actor, you could compromise the management account and then you never actually have to leave the management account. You just run these services or these features, and then these features go off and do scanning or whatever they specifically do in all the member accounts, and you never actually need to directly access those member accounts. So, and that's what I'll show in an example shortly. The next principle is just, or the next feature, or not feature, the next thing in AWS organizations is called delegated administration. So again, it would be really restrictive if all we had was a management account and default member accounts. You couldn't really do much with that. So AWS has delegated administration where you can choose to delegate administration with respect to a specific feature to a member account. So basically, you take a member account and you make it a delegated admin for a specific feature. So like, for example, you make it a delegated admin for IAM Access Analyzer, something like that. Two things happen when you do that. When you make an account a delegated admin, it gains inherent read rights on the organization overall. So, for example, account C before could only see itself in the management account. When you make it a delegated admin for anything, account C can now see the entire organization. They don't get write access, really, but they get way more read rights. So they become much more self-aware of where they are in the organization, who else is in the organization, and they can read a lot more data. And then because it's for a specific feature, a delegated admin can run that specific feature on the entire organization just like you would with trusted access. The only difference is you're really doing it from a member account, so it's kind of like a different standpoint. So the first example I'll show is IAM Access Analyzer. So kind of to summarize, assume you compromise a management account, then you can run IAM Access Analyzer in trusted access. And then Access Analyzer will go into all the accounts in the organization and scan it for any role access violations. And then you can check on the results in a few minutes and see if there's anything you can exploit. And you never have to leave the management account, you just stay in the management account. So IAM Access Analyzer, if you're not familiar with it, it just calls things that violate a trust zone. That just means it checks the trust policy, and if it trusts something outside of the zone or trust zone boundary, then it will call that out as a violation. Usually this is for a single account, so basically if a role trusts anything outside the single account, it gets flagged. When you integrate this with organizations, the trust zone expands from a single account to the entire organization. So as long as whoever you're trusting is within the organization, it's actually fine. And you can actually see in the UI, there's that little option that pops up that says current organization. So in this example, I just took one of the member accounts and I created a role that trusted star, so just trusted anyone. And then we are assuming we've compromised the management account on the left. So we've compromised account A, but that's all we've compromised. We can't really hop into any of the member accounts. We're stuck in account A. So in account A, remember you have trusted access is like flipping that on switch. So as account A, you go to the organizations, you'll see IAM Access Analyzer says access disabled. You flip that on with trusted access. That's like the on state. I show how to do it from the command line at the bottom. So you can either do it from the UI or from the command line. Once it's on, then you can go to that specific feature. You can create what they call an analyzer. It's basically like a scanner in IAM Access Analyzer. You let it run, you wait a few minutes, you check back in, and IAM Access Analyzer says that there is a role in that member account that trusts everyone. And so basically, you were able to stay in the management account the whole time, and you were able to learn about any role violations in the member accounts, and because it trusts anyone, naturally you can just assume it, and then you'll become that user in the member account. And that's what this is just showing here from the command line. Again, there were a lot of ifs there, right? Like the role has to exist that trusts everyone, and there's some other prerequisites there. I'm just trying to show that there's like 20 plus of these features, and so I'm just showing one of them. So if you compromise a management account that has trusted access, you can use those features to kind of reach into those member accounts without ever actually needing to yourself get credentials for those member accounts. And then this is delegated admin. I'll skim through this because it's pretty much the exact same attack scenario. The only difference here is rather than doing this from a management account, now assume you've compromised a member account. But because the member account is a delegated admin for IAM Access Analyzer specifically, you just basically can do the same thing. So you just run IAM Access Analyzer from that specific member account. You never need to leave that member account. It goes off, it finds the role violation, and then you can assume it again. And that's just what I'm saying here. So this is just showing to add a delegated admin. It's usually like a one or two line command line instruction, and then you can usually just do it from the UI by just specifying. But assume you've compromised account C. I also use this as an opportunity to show kind of reconnaissance within organizations. So assume you've compromised account C, and you see this UI image. So there's kind of a couple things you can deduce from this right away. One, the account is obviously part of an organization, right? Because the account might not even be part of an organization, so that's a pretty clear sign that it's in one. Two, the account is not a default member because you can see all of the AWS accounts in the organization. So you know for sure you haven't compromised a default member. It's either a management account or a delegated admin. And then three, the UI doesn't really match a management account, so it's probably a delegated admin. If you want to do this from the command line, there's also an instruction called list delegated administrators. And because you're a delegated admin, you have read rights, which means you can call list delegated admins and list yourself basically and see that you're a delegated admin, which is what I'm just doing here. And then it's the exact same thing. You run Access Analyzer, you wait a few minutes, the results come back, you can see there's a role in another member account you can exploit, and you can go ahead and assume that. So that was a lot of ifs and very like indirectly referencing member accounts. It would be really nice if there was a better way to just directly get admin access on the member accounts, and that's basically what I found with IAM Identity Center. So IAM Identity Center, again, it's an organization integrated feature. So it's the exact same thing. You have to turn on trusted access, but we'll see with IAM Identity Center, you can just make a admin user and then attach that to all the member accounts and then just sign into the member accounts as that admin user. So IAM Identity Center allows you to basically set up kind of a login system via the UI for your member accounts. And so this involves creating a user, a permission set, and then attaching that user and permission set to your member accounts. So again, we're assuming from this perspective, assume that you've compromised a management account. So you've compromised a management account. You can see there's like 30 member accounts or something like that, but you can't directly, there is no predefined role in those member accounts. So you're kind of stuck. You don't have credentials for those member accounts. You're kind of stuck in the management account. If you have enough permissions, you can go into IAM Identity Center, and remember it's in the off state by default. So you just switch it on with trusted access, which is shown there. And then we're going to create a user, create a permission set, and then attach that user and permission set to a member account, and then authenticate through the sign-in portal to that member account, and we'll just be have administrator access basically in that member account. So you create a user in IAM Identity Center, and then you create a permission set. A permission set is just kind of like I'm not an expert on permission sets specifically, but from what I understand, they're kind of like wrappers, basically, just for IAM permissions. So you just create a permission set with administrator access. And then you attach the user you created, you attach the permission you created, and you attach those all to the member account. And so that's kind of what I'm doing here. So in IAM Identity Center on the left, it actually shows you your organization. You click into one of the member accounts, you assign users and groups, you assign those two you created, and then you go to a login portal. The login UI, let's see if I have it in here. Yeah. So in IAM Identity Center at the dashboard, it gives you that login URL. So that's the URL you go to get to that login screen basically. So you go to that URL. Oops. And then you log in with the user you just created. And then once you log in with the user you just created, your member account pops up there in the little UI portal. And if you click it, you'll see it says administrator access permission set because that's the one I created. And I just click on that, and then I basically become admin in the member account. So that's kind of like where you start from the management account. If you can work with IAM Identity Center, you can just create a bunch of users and permission sets and then just attach them all to the member accounts. And you can just use this technique to just get into all the member accounts as admin. One of the other organization integrated features I found interesting was one called account management. So account management lets you set or edit basic main or alternate contact info about the AWS account itself. So if this has trusted access enabled and you can use this, then you could change like the address, city, and name for other member accounts. So it's like an interesting idea from like a phishing perspective, right? Where maybe you can't, even after all of this, you still can't get into the member account, then it might be like an interesting thought process to kind of switch those values and see if maybe you can go from a phishing standpoint or a phishing vector. And then I also bring up, at the end of 2022, AWS released a new feature for AWS organizations pertaining to SCPs. So in the past, I talked about how a delegated admin, all you really get are some more read writes. Just by being a delegated admin, that's like inherently what you get, along with whatever feature you're a delegated admin for. So at the end of 2022, AWS released this feature where you can now give permissions to delegated admins to control SCP policies. So the management account basically sets up like an allow list of specific IAM actions that delegated admins can call with respect to SCPs. So that kind of brought up some interesting scenarios where, like, in my mind, where you might have a management account that sets up a really restrictive SCP, or in this case, I just did deny all S3 actions. So like I'm the management account, I've put an SCP called deny all S3 on all my member accounts. But then I use this new feature to give some of my delegated admins some IAM actions relating to SCP. And this is kind of what the new feature looks like. So you go into AWS organizations and it's called Delegated Administrator for AWS organizations. And then you create a delegation policy and you can basically allow list a bunch of different SCP policies. So I deploy this really restrictive SCP and then I go into delegation policies and maybe I don't 100% know what I'm doing. So I just grant all the actions related to SCPs to all my delegated admins. And so that kind of is an interesting thing from an attacker perspective where let's say you compromise one of those delegated admins. Now you can try, if you go check the AWS organizations, because you have those read writes, you'll see there's a restrictive SCP on you. But because this new feature is here, there's a chance you might just be able to call the API to remove the SCP from yourself, because that's a possibility. So you just can call that API here. The other nice thing is because you're a delegated admin and you have those read writes, you can call an API called describe resource policy, and it will list what the resource policy is that the management account created. So rather, in this case, I was saying you could guess and just kind of try to brute force those APIs or just try them to see if they worked. If you want to be certain that you have the rights to remove the SCP, you can always just call describe resource policy and you'll get that resource policy that the management account set, and then you can check for sure to see if you have those permissions. And so I talked at the beginning about this organization's enumeration role. So I covered a lot of things in this talk. I covered like delegated admin, trusted access, creating accounts versus inviting accounts, SCPs, that kind of stuff. So I made another module for Pacu that's like an enumeration module for organizations. So you can run organizations enumeration, and it will basically go through and try to get like the description, the roots, the policies, the accounts, the organizational units, pretty much everything that we talked about in this talk. And so the hope is that you can run the enumeration module, and then you'll get enough out of this talk that you can interpret the results to pivot into a member account or any other account in the organization. And so that's just the result of running it from like the management account. So you get a bunch of data on the organizations. Oh, and then apparently I was feeling too ambitious that weekend, and I also put in a graph, so it makes like a nice graph of the organization. And then I ran it from a member account, and you can see you can still run it from a member account. You just don't really get much back because it's a member account, so they don't really have a ton of privileges. So I think all you get back is, yeah, the description that just tells you you're in an organization and who the management account is. Yep, so you just get the description back, and I think Oh, so then I had kind of like a final checklist of, so kind of taking everything we talked about and summarizing it, assuming that you've compromised an account, there's a couple steps you can do to kind of go through the process and see how far you can expand it or how big the blast radius is. So the first one is obviously compromising a set of AWS credentials or getting a foothold in some way. And again, that's kind of the big if. I know people have asked about that in the past, and yes, like a lot of this you can't do unless you get that foothold, but as we all know, those footholds do happen. So number one is just kind of getting that foothold. And then two is determining what type of account you are. If you're a default member account, there's really not a whole lot you can do from an organizational perspective. So really you want to be either a management account or a delegated admin. And so you can determine that from either UI fingerprinting, kind of like what I was talking about before, or you can use the AWS CLI APIs to list delegated admins and see if your account that you've compromised is in the list of listed delegated admins. And you can run that organization's enumeration module I made in Pacu. That's also merged in the official repository, so I think it's just a pip install Pacu, and it should be there. And it will gather all the necessary details, and you'll probably be able to tell really quickly if you're in an account that is either a management account or delegated admin, or if you even have enough permissions. That's another caveat I forgot to mention. A lot of this I was saying, IAM Identity Center, you create the user, you create the permission set, and then you add it to the account, and then you log in. There's a lot of steps in that process. So it's entirely possible that you've compromised a user who doesn't have those actions allowed, right? So the assumption is that you have administrator access on those member accounts or on the management account that or whatever account you've compromised. If you don't have administrator access, you can still do some of this stuff. You just might just have to be a bit more specific in terms of organization integrated features and what's actually allowed and what's not allowed. And then after you do the enumeration, if you're the management account, you can go through each member account and try to assume the default role. Actually, I think I wrote this before I made the module, so you can just run that organization's assume role module, and it will go through and try to brute force. If you don't have the list accounts permission, then you can just run the organization's assume role brute force module and just pass in a list of accounts and a list of roles. And then you don't have to rely on the list accounts API call. And then you can also try, so that's if that role even exists. If that role doesn't exist, you can also try to leverage any existing enabled service, with IAM Identity Center being kind of the desired service, because you can just make a user that's admin and attach it to one of the member accounts. And then if necessary, you can also check if you're delegated admin, whatever you might have control over that might help in pivoting. And then if you're a delegated admin, you still have a lot you can do as a delegated admin. So checking for associated delegated services to exploit, so kind of just like you would with the management account. Trying to alter existing SCPs because of that new feature they released. So if you're finding yourself blocked by an SCP and you're a delegated admin, you could go ahead and just try to call the API call to remove the SCP, and there's like a chance it might work because it could be set up that way. And then you can also check if there are any other delegated admins you have control over. And so that's kind of the checklist. In terms of defenses against this, something else that I think is worth noting is this isn't an inherent security flaw like in AWS organizations itself. This isn't a 0-day, for example, or something like that. The assumption is you need the credentials, right, or you need a foothold. And then a lot of this can also be viewed from the lens of a developer or how you would normally set up organizations. This talk is just more from the viewpoint of an attacker or pen tester, or how you could pivot around. So in terms of kind of like stopping this, the best advice I can give is, one, to protect your credentials, right? Just try to make sure that foothold never happens. But the footholds could happen. So the next one is least privilege, both at the feature level and at the user level. So all your users in your AWS account should have least privilege. I'm sure everyone's aware of that. So if a user does get compromised, you can't really do much with that. Even if it is the management account, if a user is compromised and it's a limited enough user and they can't work with any of the trusted access or anything like that, it's probably going to be a much smaller blast radius. And also with the features. So we talked about enabled services and all those organization integrated features. So if you don't need an organization integrated feature, it's probably worth just leaving it off, right? Like don't turn all the organization integrated features on, because if a user does get compromised, then they could potentially leverage that. That pretty much summarizes, and then just have logging in place. Just have logging in place to kind of detect any suspicious traffic. And then everything I talked about in this talk, if it was a lot, or you're still trying to adjust it, or it's 8 a.m. and everyone's still waking up, the 2 links at the bottom of that slide, if you snap a picture of that, that goes to the blog articles I published that pretty much cover 99% of the stuff I covered in this talk. So you can always look at that later for reference. And I believe that's the last slide. Yeah, so thanks for listening to my talk.
Hi, great talk. Thanks very much. The implication of not using the default organization account access role is, are you trying to imply that using something that is pseudo-random there will frustrate a potential attacker, and that's something you would actually advise to frustrate an attacker to pivot from management account to somewhere else?
Yeah, I missed some of that, but you were saying is it better basically to obfuscate that member, that default role account name? Yeah, that's definitely a good strategy. That's probably what I'd advise, because when you set up a member account, it chooses the same name every time. So, right, that's a bit predictable. So maybe even if you want to use the same role name, it's probably best, to change that role name so it's not. You can always brute force it still, but if you change it to a good enough role name, then hopefully that won't happen. And you can detect it before, because ideally, right, again, they shouldn't really ever be at that point. So hopefully if you change the role name to something obfuscated enough, you can kind of detect or see in the traffic fairly quickly that someone is trying to brute force all that role.
I guess a question from me. From your perspective, being on the red team side, is assuming you have compromised the management account, is that basically game over?
Yeah, so I haven't done a ton of this in terms of like in practice. A lot of this was kind of research and building it out. So in terms of if you've compromised the management account, is it game over? I would say probably, but not certainly, because again, it all depends on the user you've compromised. So even if you've compromised the management account, if you've compromised a user that can just list S3 buckets, right? Like not a bunch, but if you're saying like you have like administrator access over the management account, like you were saying, then pretty much, because at that point you're the management account, there aren't really any SCPs. I don't think to stop you, right? If you're administrator access, and then you can just get into all the member accounts. So protect the management account creds a lot.
Any other questions? Cool. Thanks, Scott.